There we go. Okay, as we head in here to week 3 of our group, the care and management of lies. So hold on, let me let somebody in there. Meeting people. Okay, so a little bit, I think everybody here was with us last time for British Mysteries, but a little bit about Jacqueline Winspear, who was born in 1955. And I thought rather than focusing on her life, she's and obviously wrote the whole Maisie Dobbs series, which she's famous for. There's 18 books in that series, and we read one of the initial one during our British Mysteries, and of course has written this book, The Care and Management of Lies. And so I thought it'd be interesting to look at where did this idea for her book come from. And she was in her mid-20s, Jacqueline Winspear, and she was in her mid-20s working for an academic publishing company, and her job was to go around and talk to professors and completely in the academic community about books, and was not an author, and in a distant dream hoped to someday to perhaps be an author. And a good friend of hers wanted to open a stall on Portobello Road to sell antiques and other items that they would find and put out there, and she offered to help her friend to look for items for that. So she went to what she calls a jumble sale, which would be like a rummage sale for us, to look for items. And she came across this book, the Wins book from 1911. The book was intact, but it was very old. And as she looked at the flyleaf of the book, she saw it was a gift to a young bride who was married 1 month before the start of World War I. Wow. And she wondered what became of her and her husband and their marriage with World War I starting. And so this was something that she just mulled around in her mind. She kept the book, was looking at the book, and she thought that at some point in her future, if she ever became a writer, she would like to do a book from this experience. And also a reminder for those of you who weren't with us for Maisie Dobbs, or have not read Maisie Dobbs, but Winspear's grandfather was in the Battle of the Somme, which you learned about last time, and had shrapnel in his leg. And her grandmother was partially blinded in an explosion at a munitions factory in 1915. So she has a lot of close family connections with World War I, and obviously a lot from her family to delve from that. And then also reading this woman's book. And when she had the opportunity and got successful with Maisie Dobbs, she brought up the idea to her publisher of writing this book at this time, and they said, go ahead and do it. So she had a lot of support. And I would recommend if you go on YouTube and say Jacqueline Winspear, The Care and Management of Lies, there's a great 45-minute interview with her with a book club where she speaks to the book club, talks about her finding this book, and she also reads passages from the book. It's very entertaining. So obviously this book, the woman's book, plays a key role in the novel, with the excerpts of it starting many of the chapters. And of course, I think in a lot of ways it informs the relationship between Thea and Kezia. So I wanted to show you, for those who are not seeing the whole woman's book, and that some of the contents of the book as you look here. So it starts out with the house, the choice, construction, Fatinos. It is very detailed on how to build your home and get the perfect home. And then, of course, mistress and servants, guide to your household work, food in the kitchen, all kinds of things, guide to laundry work, dress, its choice and care. And as I get to that, I must read for you. You can read the entire book, and I've been reading excerpts myself. Absolutely historical. I have to read this to you because I feel like this was written in 1911, and I feel other than the language, this could be written today. So this is her segment in the book on the art of dressing well. Dress is an invaluable aid to good looks, yet strange as it may seem, comparatively few women have acquired the art of dressing well. The reason for this is not hard to seek. If fashion sets the seal of her approval upon some particular style, every woman rushes blindly in its wake. No matter if the style be one that is only suitable for the tall and slender, it is embraced indiscriminately by the short and the stout, whilst with a hopeless lack of sense of what is fitting, the portly dowager of 50 will be seen to deck herself in a mode only becoming to a young girl of 18. And she goes on to tell you more about what you need to do about women who dress well instinctively and how to straighten yourself out in the clothing department. So that's one of the things in there, etiquette, and you can see the home dressmaking, millinery, health in the toilet, or toilette, I think is what they mean there, child travel, and then here's some more poultry keeping. And if you've read the book, you know that preparing poultry involved on a farm, you doing the work, not pulling Purdue out of your freezer and cooking your chicken, which I was sort of thinking I would be a vegetarian probably if I had to do that. But so many different things in here, but careers for women, the medicine, the nursing, women in business, civil service and public work. And this book is fascinating. I read this section. There's a section on recreation. It talks about how you have to be a great household for game playing and make your house the center where everybody will come and play games and it will be interesting and entertaining. And at the top here of the thing, where's my little cursor? Right here, irishfamilyhistorycenter.com. That's the link where you can look up and get this book and you can read all of it. They actually have a detailed section where you can go to the chapter and put in the page number and it'll bring up that chapter. So this book, written in 1911, was fascinating. It was done by a compendium of women. There were about 7 or 8 women involved in writing the book and contributing articles in all different areas. And I think as you go along, you'll see that it has a huge influence. Certainly from the beginning of the book, when Thea gives it to Kezia as a wedding present, as sort of a tongue-in-cheek, you're a loser and this is your life now. It's just very different. So then the second thing I wanted to talk a little bit about was hops picking, which there's quite a bit of conversation in the book in the first half. And by the way, a reminder, no spoilers. We will not talk anything past page 158 about what happens in the book. But hops picking is a big part of the book. And of course, hop picking is the process of harvesting the green cone-shaped flowers of the Humulus lupulus plant, also known as hops. Hops are the source of beer's distinctive flavor, bitterness, and aroma. Hop plants should be harvested annually, and the best time to pick depends on the variety of the hop. For example, in Irewell, North Canterbury, hops are harvested when the cones reach about 23% dry matter. Now, some pictures up here on the my right, I guess the little green ones, they look like little Brussels sprouts. Those are the hops. And hops picking started in the mid-1800s and ended about in the 1950s in Kent, which is where the novel's taking place. Over 200,000 East Enders would come from London to pick hops in September. And George Orwell said there is no worse employment exists, was his word on picking hops. They stayed in squalid conditions until some reforms were made, and then they were in what they called hop huts, built for the occasion. Pickers were paid by the bushel, and you see on the photograph on the left, a group of men, they're pouring the hops that are in the bushel into the sacks as they go. And so they were paid by that, and they often made more money than they did in London. And it could be whole families. In my next set of pictures, you can see mom with her children. And then on the right-hand side, you can see the men on their stilts who can get to the tops of the hops vines. And mentioned in the book, and I don't know if you were, as you read, we're thinking about, but an oast, O-A-S-T, they talk about the oast. That is the kiln for drying hops, is called an oast. And there are still oasts in Kent that you can see where the kilns were there. There were many, many more. Eventually, this obviously became something that could be done by machine and not by people. But as you heard in the book, a whole group, you had the East Enders coming from London by the thousands. Gypsies came in and they worked the area. And this was a big thing, big help to the farmers, like migrant labor now. There was no way they could harvest all those hops in time for the crop. And so all these people would come in, pick the hops, do the work, spend the time, enjoy being outdoors. They got out of London where the pollution was horrible. And it gave them a chance to be in the fresh air and in the countryside. And then when they finished their picking, they'd take their monies and they'd head back to London and spend the rest of the year there. So that's a little bit about the hops picking and our book. And so here we are with our questions. I'm going to jump back to the whole group in a second, but just to go through thus far, what do you make of the title? How does the focus on female characters and women on the home front? Oops, sorry, my little thing's right in the way there. There we go. Enrich our understanding of the war's impact. As the novel progresses, food and Kezia's recipes play an increasingly important role. Why so much emphasis on food? How does Winspear employ a plethora of contrasts? Kezia and Thea, Tom and Edmund Hawke, city and country, pacifism and ardent patriotism, rich and poor. And then we'll go back to poetry. I have things on the poets at the end when we get back to that. But let's stop the share here a second. And we'll go back to talk about the book a little bit. Peter, if you'd like to inform our discussion.
So to my student whom I didn't teach, what kind of observation would you like to make?
Oh, it wasn't a very nice observation. I had the audio book and I really hated the person who was the narrator. She was really bad. But there was one passage that I really liked that was talking about that it stuck in my head. Or there were two pieces. The first one was when I think it was Kezia was thinking about the war itself and how she was like, it was like lungs or something like that, where it was breathing in and breathing out, and she was being sort of sucked into the breath of war. And then the second thing that I remembered was I guess it was something it was something along the lines of, in the beginning of war, truth is the first casualty. Those are the two things that really stuck out to me.
Yeah, I think that was a quote from Aeschylus.
Yeah, I have it. I actually picked out that quote too. It was on page 115.
Yeah. Which, I suppose that partially answers the first question that I asked about why the title. What else did that was very good, Sarah. Thank you. You're temporarily off the hook. So I'd like to actually start with talking about the role of food in this novel. I mean, you could actually put together like recipe book.
I was wondering why she didn't think of doing a companion cookbook for this with all the recipes in it that are made throughout the book.
Well, maybe you and I could do it, Ginny, and we could, make money, But anyway, why do you think there's such a focus? I mean, it's a real focus on food, on meals, on, recipes.
I think it's the ultimate form of fantasy escape. It's most like food porn. Everything's rationed. They don't. Table slap for that. So this is where their imagination takes them.
Okay, other ideas.
That sort of is a common thread to keep characters together. Like we're at 150, right? So whatever, 15 pages before Tom's at war. Mm-hmm. They're writing the letters talking about the food, so it's making him homesick. He's like, maybe this is crazy, and Kezia's, misses him, so she's gotten to be very good at the house care, Ginny, right? So, she's writing about the food. So I mean, it's a common thread for some of the characters. Yeah.
Okay.
Don't you think food is always a source of family too? I mean, if people associate food with family, I mean, when you're very little, food is the closest connection you have with your mother, as you grow up, and people associate, I think over the years, we talk about this a lot in health class, how food is so associated with love that, what do you do when people love you? You make their favorite meal, you take them out for ice cream, from when you're very little, birthday cakes and things like that. I don't know if any of you, like when I'm falling down the black hole of Instagram, the ones where you see babies having their first taste of ice cream and they like jam the entire cone in their face. I think that whole idea for everybody resonates no matter where you're from, that food and love become very closely associated. And it's a source that always brings families together for meals on, big occasions, whether that's holidays or weddings or, funerals, whatever. There's always food with that. And I think she does a very good job of bringing that in a day-to-day sort of sense. And the other part I thought about was, of course, being on a farm and providing the food for everybody for the war.
She was used that to prove herself to her husband with her love for him, her creativity, someone who had no cooking skills to start with, and the efforts she went to try to impress him. And he was a harsh critic as things were prepared.
Yeah, well, he's a meat and potatoes kind of guy. So in other words, when she threw some rosemary in, it was like, whoa, what's going on? Yeah, no, that's an excellent point. How else do you think it reveals her characters, her growth as a character?
Well, it shows her evolution quite a bit because she goes in and she has no clue what she's doing, and she experiments, she tries new things, but she also, he wants chicken tonight, so I'm gonna go figure out how to kill that chicken, and it shows her dedication and it shows her growth over time. And it's something that's inherently relatable to the reader, to everybody there, but also allows you to show little increments of the changes in the dynamic between husband and wife with the war, and like little bits changing and evolving along with the world around them.
Yeah, that's excellent. And then right before the sort of midpoint, like before 158, as you said, Tom is in the war. And there's that whole section where his sergeant berates him for essentially playing with his food because it's really bad, right? How does that sort of fit in to what we've been saying?
Well, it's a safe subject for the two of them to write back and forth. It's one of the few things they can even talk about.
And it's not, it's not going to be censored. That's for sure.
Right.
Right. Okay. What about with Tom as a character?
Well, the British Army was famous for the sergeants always picking out what they thought was the weakest link in a group and picking on them. So the sergeant picked on Tom.
Yeah. And it was almost, his friend said, well, this is what they do.
Right.
This is, but when you think of where Tom was and where he ends up, it's really a stark contrast. I mean, there he was, a very
over the manor,
accomplished farmer, well respected in the community. And here he's, which is again, an indirect kind of commentary on war, right? So you have these two sisters, Kezia, and how does she contrast with Dorrit, or not Dorrit, but
Thea.
Yeah, you have to love.
Don't call me Dorrit. I'm done with that Dickens stuff.
You have to love all the Dickens.
I love all the Dickens, all the pastures, the Marshalsea farm. It's awesome. Poor Tom would have been Pip if he'd had his way.
I know. Yeah. So clearly, Winspear's up to something by contrasting these two sisters. What do you think is the most or important elements of this contrast? And how do they sort of, contribute to the way we understand the take on war that Winspear, or on World War I, that Winspear is trying to convey to us?
Can you ask that question again? I want to write it down so I can think about it.
Yeah. Essentially, Winspear creates a lot of contrasts, right, which I elicited in the questions. And I guess the question is, how do the contrasting characters of the two sisters provide a kind of view of the war, perspective or perspectives that we then learn more about the essence of being there in wartime?
Well, you have the pacifism that Thea has. That's a whole train right now for 150 pages of her getting almost caught. The other woman gets caught. So you're having the whole pacifism driving Kezia. She sort of doesn't know what she's doing just yet, but she's getting dragged down there. Well, let's support the war because Tom's going, and food, et cetera, et cetera. So the contrast of just pro-war and anti-war there.
Okay.
I think they have interesting personalities in that Thea is sort of the passionate, throwing herself into every cause that comes along, whereas Kezia is more a person to me of quiet strength, who sort of reads the people around her and tries to make everybody's lives better, where I see Thea, first she's in the suffragette cause and, working on votes for women. And then when that gets sidelined by the war, she jumps right into the pacifism. She's looking like to stir things up and really make something happen. And Kezia is sort of more attuned to her surroundings. I feel like the way for somebody who had no background in farming and everybody thought she was going to be a terrible farmer's wife, she really tries to intuitively learn about what farm life is like, and like gets loved by the people in the village, realize that she's really nice and how she works with the people, when she makes breakfast for them, and of course threw them off by putting like sprigs of parsley on their eggs and things like that. And, doing these so different, putting out linen napkins to wash their hands with, when they would have just wiped them on their pants.
They say, they look at her belt, they look at her clothes.
She does a lot to like make things happen on her own in a different, softer way, I guess. And Thea's more demonstrative in it. And throughout, the first half of the book, you just see they're sort of tugging back and forth on, and from when they were younger as well, in school together, their personalities. That's a lot of what I was thinking as I read this.
There's also a difference in their perspectives on the war and how it's going to affect them. The rural person thought it was not going to affect them at all, but it ends up affecting them a lot, so far as taking the men away from the farm, taking their horses. The impact there was much greater than they anticipated.
Yeah, that's really good. That's really that whole city country contrast also, is sort of embedded in those two characters, right? Other ideas about those two characters, because they clearly they're the most important female characters, and then you have another contrast between perhaps the most important male characters would be, Tom, and I always call them
Edmund.
What's that?
Edmund Hawkes.
Edmund. Yeah, I always call him Ethan.
I think his life has a.
Yes. Oh, I thought somebody was responding. So, with those two women, does Winspear seem to show any kind of sympathy with one over the other, or is she a kind of equal opportunity writer?
She prefers Kezia so much. At least it feels in my read. It's much more sympathetic to Kezia, which is funny because, like, I take on the war aside because it's hard to look back knowing what we do now. Like, personally, I feel like I connect more with Thea.
Yes.
But feels like the author, like, Kezia almost feels too perfect. She's the chipper Pollyanna. She's there to support her husband, there to support the farming. I'll learn whatever I need to do. And whereas, like, Thea's just kind of here to mess stuff up and, overthrow the patriarchy and kind of like just make the world a more chaotic place, which is just a very interesting dynamic, when at the end of the day, neither is right or neither is wrong, because it's very easy to look at the pro-war pacifism movement, knowing what we know now with how the war ended up. But I don't know, when I was reading it, definitely feels like Winspear prefers Kezia.
Sarah, did you have your hand up? Or was that just...
I just did the clapping.
You were clapping. Okay, I was sure if you were clapping. I missed the symbol there.
Yeah, it definitely is clear. And I swear, I don't know if anybody else has done the audiobook, but a thought that I had when I was listening to the audio person talk about Kezia is I was like, I want to pop this woman's head like a pimple, because it was so just like, and then she did this thing and she made it so beautifully on this. And it was just like, okay, like, take a break. Like, you're just making dinner. Like, I'm sorry. That feels very like anti-girls girl, but I couldn't take it anymore. I
did the audiobook too, Sarah. But I also think that Kezia is your British stiff upper lip person that like soldiers on, which the British are famous for not being emotional and soldiering on, whereas Thea is much more emotional. Kendall, were you going to say something?
Yes. I was waiting for everybody to speak their piece. I mean, I think Winspear clearly puts the tension of the book, not the only tension, but a central tension of the novel between these two characters. And there's a tension there so far in what we've read halfway through. And it clearly, the relationship and the two characters' personalities, interests, clearly are used to illustrate the tensions within British society in the excuse me, in the first half of the war. You had the women who were handing out the white feathers to men who they thought should be, fighting, even if they were only 16 or something, or if they were engaged, like farmers. Farmers didn't have to go into the war because they were working in an essential piece of the economy. And so you had that tension, and the peaceniks were traitors in the minds of the vast majority of the British population. They had no time for that. And the very tense period of women's suffrage leading up to the war had set a lot of people's teeth on edge, and a majority of women were still uncomfortable with what the suffragettes were pushing in 1910, 1913, etc. And I think those characters are used very adeptly to show the tension within British society.
That's great. Why do you think that Kezia actually doubts herself from time to time? Why do you think Winspear does that? Like, she'll say, "I'm losing part of myself. I've taken on this responsibility for the farm. But what have I given up?" Because
teaching.
Say what?
Teaching. That's basically what she's given up. It's being an independent teacher. Yeah, but she's developing into a new career. She's forced into it, but she's developing herself as the runner of the farm. Even though it's said many times that, they're going to be back by December, and then it was going to be, which is what, 6 months or 7 months, and then it was going to be in the spring. So it's a short thing, and everyone will be back and all that. But now it turns out to be, long-term, multiple years. And she's giving up something she really liked to do. It was her individuality. Now she's just a farmer.
She gave up her whole identity as herself. I mean, like, when she became the farmer's wife, like, everything that she did now revolved around her relationship to her husband and her relationship to the farm, neither of which were hers to begin with. So it's not just giving up teaching, she's giving up her identity as Kezia as she existed pre-marriage.
Yeah, but that was the norm of the day.
What?
They did that in those days.
Right.
They would not have done anything else.
Right. If you remember Tom talking about his mother, that her sole job was to be making sure her father had his meals and things were going, like she didn't want a mirror in the room because you'd be too busy worrying about what you look like instead of worrying about your husband, which was the most important thing. But I thought it was interesting that Winspear brought in, and I couldn't decide if this was her trying to sort of inject today's thoughts in it, or things actually had, was the fact that Kezia's mother told her to have money of her own and to do things on her own and don't ask permission, just do them and let them know. And I don't know whether everybody else felt that was like sort of injecting like today's woman into the past, or would her mother have really said that to her, like, make sure you have money of your own and do things on your own and don't ask permission. Just make sure he knows that you're going to take days to go into town or go off and read and write in your journal. I'm sort of interested whether that was her just, injecting something from now, or whether we really thought there were women then that were telling their daughters that.
Probably a little bit of both.
Yeah. I mean, you can't, at least I couldn't, I mean, it was so clear when I was reading about Thea, thinking about, protests that are going on today, throughout the world, and thinking of how she, as a protester, is viewed, and we pretty much know how she's viewed, by the people around her, not the pacifists, but those whom she hands out the pamphlets and so forth to. And I guess with her, I find Winspear sort of indirectly sympathizing more because of her independent nature. Her, rebellious spirit, because she really does have, in some ways, more to lose than Kezia. I mean, Kezia, continued, she's great with the farm. She's innovative with cooking, but so much of it is, dependent on pleasing Tom, right? I mean, like, and that, certainly would be, it's an interesting thing when you have an author, unlike any of the other authors we've read, who is writing decades after the war. And so, the amount that the, contemporary Winspear sort of intercedes in the novel in creating characters, I think adds to the tension in the book. In other words, Thea's a protester. People were after her. It's only by meeting her friend that she decides, okay, this is really what the war is like. I'm going to become essentially an ambulance driver. So she, has that's a very difficult, to go from a pacifist to becoming, a part of the war, even though she's not fighting, obviously, but she's still a direct part of the war. And I just, I wonder whether that's partly because, Winspear was not writing in, 1920 or 1925.
She knows what's going to happen.
Well, exactly. Hindsight is 2020, right?
Yeah.
And okay, good point.
Also, I think it's interesting. I thought it was interesting that Thea caved so quickly at the thought of things going awry for her. Like, she's all passionate about the suffragette and the pacifism movement. The minute her friend, killed herself and had the horrible jail experience of being, having a tube put in to feed her, then she's sort of like, I don't want to be arrested. I don't want to go on a starvation strike. I don't want to be tube fed, or have anything's happened to me. And like, you know what? Now I got to get out of this. Like, her convictions were not as strong. She wasn't one of these protesters like the other women who literally, some of them died, and certainly went to them getting into what they talked about, the catch and release, where when they starved themselves, then they'd set them free till they were well again and arrest them again. But, she was all about her cause till something really bad was going to happen to her. And suddenly, you know what? Maybe I better get out of the country before I get arrested and thrown in jail. And of course, in the title, The Cannan Management of Lies, how she won't tell Kezia why she's suddenly enlisted in the war. Like, she's like, why are you going? And she very carefully lies around the whole thing, and not saying that, she doesn't admit that she knew Avril and that, anything bad had happened. She's just gets her back up and is like, yeah, I'm just going to the war because I'm going to the war, not because I'm, afraid of what's going to happen to me.
I think that makes her an infinitely more interesting character.
Yeah.
Because I feel like that's what we want her to do. We want her to be the hero and to be like, no, I'm going to take a stand and I'm going to risk my life and blah, 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 blah. But it feels more real to me. Just like, I don't know, you hear stories and you meet people. Like, I've met people who have been injured in protests, like like irreversibly injured, and it makes me scared to like, it makes me reconsider. And I'm like, yeah, I can kind of understand how like, having someone have their stomach pumped full of food and then killing, like throwing themselves into a river, maybe that would like dissuade me a little bit. But I do like, it's like, you do kind of want her to like, you're the one that takes the stand. Like that's what you should do. But I think the fact that she doesn't, and that she switches around, it makes her, I don't know, a little more, I think, relatable and a little more human.
A little more what?
Human.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I appreciate that, because I think that too. It's more like what might really happen. Like Kezia seems to be more an idealized version of what how you would want somebody to act, but she's a more real person, because she's like, oops, I am afraid. I need to get out of here, and I don't want this to happen to me. And as you said, I watch the protests now and I'm thinking, I know I'd be the last person who'd stay out there if the police showed up with clubs and things. I'd be long gone.
Yeah.
I also I think Thea seems like she doesn't have a goal in her life. She seems lost, where Kezia, she's got a goal. She's married Tom. She's going to be the farmer's wife. She's going to best she can. I think Thea's still looking for something. She's a teacher and she likes it, but I think she's looking for something.
Does that make her, I mean, like, to me, that makes her a more interesting character.
Yeah.
I can figure out Kezia. I mean, because after all, what is Thea doing? I mean, she's, in a way, she's choosing another path, but it's a path that can very easily get her killed. I mean, she's not back on the farm.
Right.
Right. She's driving an ambulance through the war. I mean, there's a lot of, the chances she takes are so much, more profound than those.
How new are these roles for women in war? My recollections of other wars, women were in either camp followers or nursing. But how about actively opposing a war or participating in battlefield situations? What happened before?
Well, there was a lot, go back to Florence Nightingale. I mean, the women as nurses, on the
But beyond the nursing role.
Yeah. Well, Kendall, you may be able to, but from what I know is that this was the first war, first of all, where women could assume a role that was non-combative, but still contributive.
True. There were several women's organizations that were tied to the military side of things, though obviously they weren't directly in, but they were in support roles. And I'm not speaking of ambulance drivers, although that was a big one as well. And of course the nursing piece, which does start with Nightingale, but that's thriving
Yes.
by the time we get to World War I, the nursing side of things. And again, I go back to my statement. These two women reflect the division within British society at that time. And the protesters are the minority, those who are willing to speak up. That doesn't mean that there weren't more women that would agree, but that was not their place. It's after the war, after 1918, that women take much bigger role, in part because of the results of the war, in part too because there's so many men dead in England and France and Germany. We never talk about Germany, but
Yeah.
Germany was just as devastated in population as the winners. So I think it's unusual, and I think there's some 21st century or 20th century thinking, anyways, in Winspear's dealing with this character, and I wouldn't take it too far that there's that many women.
Yeah.
Well, it's the first war where actually the soldiers aren't aiming their guns at people; they're just shooting them, and where they land, for the most part, nobody knows. And whether there's women at the other end or soldiers at the other end of the shot, they don't know. So they're not really targeting women, but women just are getting in the way.
Except for the Germans. Germans in the invasion of Belgium killed, murdered, if you want, at least 6,000 civilians in a very short time when they're invading through. The whole Belgian, the rape of Belgium, as it's known, is a fascinating read, and the motivation of German soldiers and why they did all that. And that's a very complicated discussion. But this World War I is a war, as a total war. It's the first truly total war where, Germans send a dirigible over, across the channel, and they bomb a tavern. I forget the name of the tavern. It's the first time there's an aerial bombing in war. And the Allied side is not going to do that now, but look what happens in World War II. I mean, aerial bombing of massive cities and stuff. So it's coming. We're at the edge. World War I breaks down all the barriers. It's the game changer. Far more in many ways than World War II.
Thank you.
Can I get back to Thea?
You can do anything you want.
As the title of the book, Management of Lives, Thea may not have even thought about becoming an ambulance driver if she had any idea what was really going on in Europe and what the dangers were, because I doubt if those people really knew. And she may have been too scared to go.
I think
that's a really good point.
Go ahead, Peter.
No, what I was going to say is, think about the implications of we're only halfway through. The implications of the care and management of lives. Care and management of lives. You've brought up an excellent point. And, sometimes the lying can be almost what isn't said. What people don't know, what say a government or the media is keeping away from people. I mean, that you could see as a lie as well, right?
Right. Well, don't they talk about the fact that they're bringing the wounded in the middle of the night?
Yes.
So nobody knows how many people are dying, and they have no idea of the casualties, how they're disfigured they are. They're sneaking them in in dark, and dealing with it so that the general population doesn't realize to have a really clue. Just like all the boys in the beginning who enlist from the village are like, it reminds me like, Gone with the Wind in the beginning of that with the Civil War, where they're all like, let's go, we're going to be done with this in 10 minutes. And they're all saying the exact same thing. We're going to go over there and we'll be done, in a month, having no clue what it's going to be like. And that seems so often the case when a war breaks out, that people think their side is going to be able to end it very quickly. And, the government's manipulating the truth, as well as people, within individuals. Kezia not telling Tom what's happening at home, Thea not telling Kezia what's going on with her, Kezia not wanting to, worry the helpers with what's happening. Everybody's trying to manipulate to keep things as smooth as they can. And that's how they're managing those lies.
That's really
Thea seems to be very shallow to me, because she gets caught up in this, then that, suffragettes and that, but she's not really committed to it. She changes so quickly, and for reasons that aren't really haven't that much to do with the real cause. At least that's what I think. And then she's trying to escape, and she becomes an ambulance driver. It's just she flits from one thing to another.
I do think at the time, as Kendall said, the suffragette movement did move to the peace movement in a nod to the war. They decided they weren't going to fight for women's votes while they're trying to wage a war. So most of the suffragettes went over to the pacifist movement or just supported the war. So that was sort of a trend everybody was doing, and then of course, I don't think it's a bad reason to be in direct fear for your life. Like if you told me my choice was to go to prison and have a tube run down my thing. And since I've had a tube run down in my stomach a couple times recently, I can say I would definitely be like, I'll go to France, get me out of here. I'd do anything to avoid that kind of thing. And so I don't think I think it's a valid reason to want to be out of the country and try to do something, even though she's naive in realizing that she's jumping from the frying pan into the fire to go to Europe. But she doesn't know that.
Yeah,
and
she
nobody
doesn't
else
know that.
does. She doesn't know it. And neither does anybody else. I mean, all these women that are going think it's going to be like, this is great. We're going to help out driving, and we're not going to see guys, with half their face missing or, all their limbs missing. That's not what they're thinking when they're signing up.
There's that moment in the when she's in the train, and it's the conductor, I think, who sort of chuckles a bit when she says she's going to be a driver during the war, and she said, I can take apart one of these trucks, it's the war. So I think there is, she's aware to a certain extent of what it means, just because of the kind of training that she went through. One thing that you were saying earlier that just sort of struck me was, you were mentioning how, the young men in the country, but also young men in general, were joining up, almost like, hey, this is kind of cool. This, part of it was, this is kind of cool. But it also brings up another contrast. And that is, because at first, when I first read the book, I just couldn't quite understand the presence of Edmund. Like what's this guy here for? What do you now I'm saying it as very much a Winspear's interest in looking at class during the war and the effect that the war had on different classes.
Don't we also love Edmund because he'd really rather just sit and write poetry like everybody else in World War I who was enjoying writing poetry?
Yeah. And he's a dreamer. He's a dreamer, and who else is a dreamer?
Kezia. I'm not a fan of him. I didn't like him in the beginning because when they were introduced, it's like, oh, there we go. It felt very like romancy, and then it's like, oh, this girl's so happily married to like this guy, and then there's this other guy that's sneaking in and is like actually maybe the perfect match for her. And I was like, all right.
He likes his horse and his dog better. If he has this picture of his horse and his dog, he likes them much better.
But why is he there? I mean, why is he there? Is he there to sort of provide the representation of, and he's not really like the upper class. I mean, he's, he obviously had a, derelict father who, said, I'm going to beat you at darts, or you can have, a good portion of my property. It's like, duh. So he's a lot more responsible, than that. But why is he there? Why did you, did he annoy you? Did he, why do they keep putting, or why does Winspear sort of put him and Kezia in these potentially, romantic situations? Like, sees her at the train, sees her being picked up at the train, and it's like, oh, keeps on looking, keeps on.
Well, it's a good way of enticement to make sure you read the whole book. I mean, it's when it started and she's asleep near the pond, when he's so nice to her and blah blah blah. you think, okay, this is going to create a romance while the husband goes to war and she has a romance with a guy. I mean, you could see that happening. Of course, it doesn't happen, but it just gets you to, okay, what's going to happen?
That's a really good point. I mean, it's a definite trick that that Winspear is playing with us, right? Because I was damn sure when the first time I read the book, oh boy, but here's the story. He's the rich neighbor. He's polished in a way that Tom is not polished, sophisticated. She's going to fall for him.
But Doc, that's so predictable, and we both know Winspear is not predictable.
I know, and that's the point.
Right.
I mean, that's the point that her skill of playing with us, the readers, right?
I also think too, it does let them see different types of people within the village from, as you say, different walks of life. Like he's somebody who was school oriented, wanted to write poetry, liked his horse and his dog and the life there. And that was sort of his thing. And the way he looked at the war was he had an obligation to go to show people that, he was willing to serve, and you have Tom who's down to earth and doing his things. And even the different, like Ada, we haven't mentioned her much, but, Ada's got a role in the house, on how to talk nicely with your servants so they'll like you when you have to push them around. But, she's sort of all the different walks of life at the time. He's just another sort of slice of what a small town life would be like. You'd have the person, in the landed manor that threw the big party for the town, and a chance to sort of learn about somebody like that.
I also saw Hawks and Kezia kind of as parallels in trying to learn on the fly with something completely new, because Kezia was trying to learn like how to upkeep the farm, and for most of the book, the preludes to each chapter are like the women's book, and then there's one chapter, I think it's like chapter 7, where it flips to an infantry training manual, and then when it's talking about Hawks in the battlefield, it's also talking about how he feels like he has no experience and he's essentially learning through attrition because his senior officer got killed and now he's in charge and trying to learn. So I kind of saw like them as parallels of like trying to learn something completely new and like adjust to a new life.
Do you see a connection in the motivation of between Tom and Edmund and in why they decided to go to war? Seems like Winspear is interested in that question.
Well, once again, it goes back to the title, Care Management of Lives. They made it sound like it's so honorable to go, so that's why Edmund went, and Tom the same way. Even though actually both of them should have been able to stay because they had big farms making a lot of food. And I'm assuming Edmund did that because he had a very large place. Yeah. So both of them could have been exempted, and probably if they were smart, they would have been. But the lies that came out of the government made it that, gee, it's going to be quick and we'll come back in December and continue on with the crops. So it's just more lies.
Yeah. I think if you read the first half of All's Quiet on the Western Front, that book could very easily have been called Care and Management of Lies also, because that's what it's all about. It's all about, energetic, gung-ho, let's go get them German troops that, it didn't take them long to find out the same thing that Tom and Hawks are finding out. Hey, this ain't the picnic that they cracked it up to be. We really don't want to be here, and but they're stuck, and it was a very difficult thing for those. How anybody survived is beyond me. Listening to the way that they just killed people in droves.
Bigger than droves.
Robin's point is well made, and it's important to understand that by mid-1915, sometimes early, some earlier, there is a lot of understanding appreciation between the two sides at the boot level, not among the officer class, but among those who are pulling most of the triggers. And they adopt all kinds of tactics to try to help each other. And this is clearly documented by mid-1915, shelling the other side when they know their tea time is up. Live and let live was a major philosophy for many of them. And you could point and aim, if you weren't a sharpshooter, you could just shoot and not really try hard to hit anything.
But upon an advance, you could, if you just pointed and shot, you'd probably hit somebody along with it because of the mass of people coming across.
Well, during the charges, yes, but otherwise in the trenches, no.
And it was just artillery.
Now, another thing related to both of these, or in contrast to those guys, is that, and Winspear doesn't make a huge deal of it, but she's definitely wants us to understand that it wasn't just the potential excitement of being in the war that attracted young. What else was it?
Honor.
Food.
God and country.
Right, the poor, right, 3 meals a day in a place.
Yeah. Sleep, food, care, warmth,
exactly.
Clothing. It looked like everything was going to be hunky-dory. It was a place a way of staying alive instead of being poor and starving in England or Germany, for that matter.
You also have to think about that Yeats poem where the guy just, the Irish airman, where he's saying, well, I don't really have any love for the English. I didn't, I'm just a poor Irish guy with really no future. So I did this, right? And that, there were a lot of poor, she's talking about this whole class of men who are joining not for God and country, but to survive.
3 squares a day.
Maybe in a better way than they're surviving now, right?
Peter, speaking of poetry, we have a little less than 15 minutes left. Would you like to try to get to the poems, or do you want to continue?
You're very subtle.
I am subtle. I'm just trying to keep you on track. If you'd like to do it,
I understand that, and
continue.
I appreciate all the control. But well, why don't I say that we can get to the poems in a minute, but what's another issue that any of you might have that we've sort of ignored, and perhaps that we can take up next time with the second half of the book? Are there any, if we hit the major things, or are there certain things that you think we missed? Damn, we've been good then. All right.
On to the poetry.
Yes.
I'm not going to be able to be with you next week, and I'd like to leave you with a paragraph out of a favorite book of mine, if you don't mind. I'll take 2 minutes. And it is about poetry, so.
All right. Okay.
Gee, thanks, Peter.
Yeah,
this is from The Last Great War, British Society and the First World War by Adrian Gregory. It's a very good book, social history. Niall Ferguson is not a historian to accept the conventional wisdom. He is a self-consciously revisionist and deeply provocative. But the final paragraph of The Pity of War, which is Ferguson's book, puts him squarely in the predominant popular tradition. The title of this book, then, is at once a sincere allusion to Wilfred Owen's twice-used phrase and an echo of the understated idiom of the ordinary private soldier of the trenches. The First World War was at once piteous, in the poet's sense, and a pity. It was something worse than a tragedy, which is ultimately something we are taught by the theater to regard as unavoidable. It was the greatest error of modern history. Everything in this statement reflects what the mass of people in Britain already think about the First World War. For the British, the war is, at worst, an apocalyptic fall from grace, at best, the definitive bad war. In 1996, on Remembrance Day, it was described by former Education Secretary Kenneth Baker as the greatest disaster of the 20th century. The public rhetoric of Remembrance Day brackets the First and Second World War together in Britain. The poppy is worn in remembrance of the dead of both wars. We are told incessantly that the dead of both wars sacrificed their lives to preserve our freedom. But the British public doesn't believe this. It believes that the dead of the Second World War did this, but that the dead of the First World War died in vain. In schools, the First World War is taught more as tragic poetry than as history.
Yeah, I think that's exactly. I think if you would in 1914, if you'd aligned the armies up from both sides and would have said, "All right, this is what's going to happen," and it's described them what was going to happen in the next 4 years, they'd have stopped it right then. I don't think there's any way. There's no way.
The generals would have kept going because they thought they knew how to do it.
Didn't mean to start anything here.
The end of what Kendall said, the point.
World War III is breaking out.
But what Kendall said, I mean, we all can agree, right? I mean, we all learned about World War I, and it's like, oh, it was horrible, but the World War II, you think, is worse.
Not really.
Exactly.
No. I feel like people thought World War II really accomplished something, whereas World War I didn't accomplish anything because there was World War II.
Started on Armistice Day.
Yeah, I'm reading a book called The Young Hitler, and it's really fascinating to see as we're now, he is literally in World War I, but it's so interesting to see the degree to which the end of World War I provided the foundation for World War II. It's just so, I mean, it's a very, very good book. It's called Young Hitler. All right, let's do a quickie here with The Glory of Women. Now, I chose that poem to throw you for a loop. Do I have a reader?
I'll read if they're up.
Go for it.
Okay. You love us when we're heroes, home on leave, or wounded in a mentionable place. Your worship decorations, you believe that chivalry redeems the war's disgrace. You make us shells. You listen with delight by tales of dirt and danger fondly thrilled. You crown our distant ardors while we fight and mourn our laureled memories when we're killed. You can't believe that British troops retire when hell's last horror breaks them and they run trampling the terrible corpses blind with blood. O German mother dreaming by the fire, while you are knitting your socks to send to your son, his face is trodden deeper in the mud.
Okay. Nicely read. How would you describe Sassoon's attitude towards the women on the home front?
He didn't like them very much.
He didn't like them very much. And why? Because that's really what's the core of this. And obviously the title is, really ironic, but what is there that he's seeing? Where this is, he certainly became an anti-war poet.
Right.
This is, he is talking about the home front, the women who are at home. What does he seem to resent the most?
That they don't get it. They don't understand what actually went on in the war, or they don't want to see it.
So what do they want to see?
The glory of the war.
Good.
The glory of the British Army.
Okay.
They've bought the propaganda that they've been
Yeah.
sold of you worship our heroism, the glory, dulce et decorum est, kind of in the not, ironic sense of the phrase.
And it's more of the care and management of lies, isn't it?
Right.
I mean, this whole, what he's talking about. By the way, if you want a sort of a minor table slap, what kind of a poem is this?
Is it a sonnet?
It's a sonnet. Excellent.
Yeah.
Okay, it's a sonnet. It's a sort of modified Petrarchan sonnet because he plays with the rhyme scheme.
Right.
Are there any particular phrase? There are a couple of phrases that really got to me. I remember when I first read it a while ago. One of them is mentionable place.
I love that one. Wounded in a mentionable place. Oh, your arm. That's terrible.
Yeah, but that's okay.
Right.
It's okay to mention that, right? Yeah. You worship decorations. Here's one I think that's really cool. You make us shells. How can you see that? What are the implications? That's a great line.
Women in the munitions factory.
Ah.
You're making the shells to blow us up. And you listen.
So in other words, so then what we become is simply shells.
Yeah.
We're shells. So you're making us into shells.
Right, but also you're making shells. It's sort of a double thing. It's both.
Yeah. So yeah, exactly. What do you make of the last three lines? Why is the German mother brought in?
To say one side was as bad as the other.
Okay, and he's speaking to her, right? Oh, German mother dreaming by the fire. While you were knitting socks, send your son. His face is trodden deeper in the mud. Does there seem to be any difference to you between the way that he has been talking about women before those three lines and the last three lines?
I think he's really kind of saying that the Germans' mothers aren't being told the truth either. And the care and management of lives are, it's on both sides of the house. And
yeah,
Germany was doing the same thing that the Brits were doing.
That's good. But why, to me, it seems the German mother is not really criticized.
No, it's just more of a universal erosion of women thinking it's heroic and it's not. So it's just sort of a universal, not German or British or anything.
Yeah, no, I get that. It just, I was very surprised with those last three lines. I mean, I could see the poem, even though it wouldn't be a sonnet, ending with blind with blood.
Right. I thought it was a nice contrast to be thinking about the other side, that while, all these things about these talk about their women who are all into the heroes and the, being able to talk the thrill of adventures they're having. But the German mother who's sitting by the fire, guess what? Your kid's face down in the mud too. And not much is happening. It's kind of, to me, it's like a really downer way to finish the poem, reminding you that both sides have people who are being, mutilated and having a horrible end.
And she's, the other thing is that I thought one reason of it would be that he knows the women he's talking about in the first lines. Right. These are the British women whom he knows. He doesn't know the German. In other words, she's more of an abstraction. she's, sort of the quintessential mother, right? Again, still, still being lied to and so forth. But it's such a gentle, the idea of knitting socks, it's such a gentle action. And there's nothing that is gentle about the references to the Englishman. I just think it's sort of an interesting that the poem ends that way.
Yeah, because he could have just not even said German mother. He could have just said, "Oh, mother dreaming by the fire," and referred to both mothers of the English and the Germans.
Yes.
But he didn't.
Yeah.
But the only thing he really knows is when the Germans attack, the slaughter on their side is just as bad as when the Brits attack. And, their face is trodden deeper in the mud, happens both ways.
Yeah.
On each attack. And the number of people that have been lost that way are astronomical.
Yeah.
Could this also
He's
be a
just
reaction-
assuming the stuff happening in Germany because he doesn't really know.
Could this also
Right,
be a
okay.
reaction to what he's hearing about, the propaganda, the mighty Brit is glorious and fantastic, and the Germans are, the evil monsters that we're fighting? And could it be a subversion of that, of taking kind of the propaganda and turning it on its head, whereas the British are not necessarily the heroes that they're conveyed, and that maybe the Germans are not necessarily the monsters that we've been told?
Ah, that's really good. I like that. Yeah, that's smart. Kendall?
I think Sassoon is guilty of revealing to us his bitterness and how he has turned against the war. And he's, I think, very guilty of stereotyping here, because the soldiers returning home on leave or at the end of the war, they're not talking. And then, of course, this is true in
Any
every
war.
war. And so they're not communicating. They feel out of place. And the wife or girlfriend or sister feels out of place because they're not communicating, and the women don't know how to react. So I think he's guilty of. I don't like this poem. I think it's way off base. I think he's guilty of stereotyping, simplifying a very complex personal situation.
It's off base only if you're looking at it from a strictly historical perspective, because this is the way he sees it, right? It's sort of like
He's certainly entitled to his opinion.
Yeah, but he's taking a definite slant on it. This is his reality, just as the speaker of Dolce, that is his reality.
So just to jump in again there, it's 8:48. So I think we need to, Paul says that we could save our other poem for the start next time.
Whatever. We'll just play around with it.
We can jump that in and then be ready for the second half of the book to see how things turn out for those of you who haven't read
by
ahead.
the way, read I mean, I know Kendall and Ginny and I have read the whole book. Did anybody was anyone like, no? Okay.
Cynthia has read it.
Okay.
Yeah. But others, no spoilers, we won't say, but next week we'll know how things turn out. Write down on a piece of paper tonight what you think happens at the end. This is my favorite thing with my brothers. We do when we watch any movie that has a war or a conflict, we have to immediately write down which people will not make it to the end after the first 10 minutes. and then we see who was right about which ones weren't going to make it.
There's some good surprises.
I'm on my second try I'm on my halfway through the second time.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody.
Goodbye, everybody.
Take care.
Thank you.
Have a wonderful
Take
evening.
care.
I'm going to stop our recording here.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Good night.
Go Phils.
Go Phillies.
Go Yanks.
Oh.